Welcome to Chapter 13 of our Primavera P6 training, End Value Management, EVM, End Value Management. So if you've been following our discussion so far, remember we said that in project management that there are 5 process groups, which are initiating, and then planning, and then executing, and then monitoring and controlling, as well as closing. So far so good. We've taken a look at initiating. Remember I told you all the activities you do to start the project. And then we also talked about planning. Planning is where we basically created our schedule and all our project management planning. And then after we talked about planning, we also discussed executing. Executing was where we now talked about updating our status, reporting actual start date and finish date. So this is the point where we are now. We're monitoring and controlling. So monitoring and controlling is where we now track our project. So this is where tracking comes in. And one major tool we use in tracking is now the end value management. That's a major tool that we actually use when it comes to project tracking. So under the end value management, there are a couple of things we're going to be looking at. So these are specific indices that we're going to be looking at. So we have what we refer to as the planned value, and then we have the end value, we have the actual cost, there's a budget at completion, there is the estimate at completion, we also have the estimate to complete, and then we also have the variance at completion. So all of these are quite necessary, especially if you're preparing for the PMP exam. You probably need an understanding of all of these formulas to be able to scale through your exam. However, if you're not preparing for the PMP exam, you might not really need to bother so much into understanding the formulas and all of that, because these formulas are infused into Primavera P6 by default. So in most cases, all you simply need to do is to display the relevant columns. However, beyond displaying the relevant columns, you need to understand what all of these things mean, or what they signify, or what they stand for. So the moment you're able to understand what they mean, and then of course whatever figure you're now seeing in your Primavera P6, you are going to be able to interpret it, and then at the end of the day come up with a final analysis of the status of your project. So let's do a little bit of illustration in order for us to be able to clearly define some of these things that we have made mention of so far. Okay, so let's explain each of these components. But before we do that, first of all, I want us to take a look at the formula for each of these values that we use in, or terms that we use in Primavera P6. Okay, so let's explain what each of these components mean. So remember we talked about the planned value. We also mentioned the end value, which is EV, and then the actual cost, and then the budget at completion, the cost variance, schedule variance, cost performance index, schedule performance index, estimate at completion, estimate to complete, and then variance at completion. So these are some of the end value indices that we are going to be using. Now, let's assume we have a project to build a 4-sided fence, and we have decided that each side will cost $1,000. And it will take 1 week to complete each side. So each side, we're going to be spending 1 week for each side. 1 week. So that's exactly the project that we are doing. So remember, this is a fence, 4-sided fence, and we've said that okay, each side is going to cost us $1,000, and then it will take 1 week to complete each side. And then at the end of the report in week 1, you now got the following report: 50% or half of the work was done, and then $700 was spent. So remember we said at the end of week 1, you got the following report: 50%, in other words, they did half of the side of the fence, and then they spent $700. So let's start with the planned value. So remember we said that planned value is how much we plan to spend on a periodic basis in the course of carrying out the project. And that's what we refer to as the planned value. So in this case, since we are going to be measuring on a weekly basis, our planned value is 1,000. And that's exactly what our planned value is. Remember, planned value, how much we plan to spend on a periodic basis, which of course our unit in this case is on a weekly basis. Now, end value from a layman's definition is the amount of money that should have been spent based on the volume of work that was done. So remember I said end value is the amount of money that should have been spent based on the volume of work that was done. Now, I'm just giving you a layman's definition of these terms. Otherwise, if you check maybe some of your text, the definition may sound a bit different, but this is basically to enable you understand exactly what these terms mean. So in this case, remember, at the end of work in week 1, they did half the side of the fence, and it was reported that they spent $700. But don't forget, we had already said that a side will cost us $1,000. So it therefore means that if they do half the side, they should be spending about $500 and not $700 which was spent. Remember we said one side 1,000. And if we assume an even pace of work, it therefore means that since they did half the side, they should spend 500. So in this case, our end value is 500. So 500 basically is the amount of money that should have been spent based on the volume of work that was done. And that's why this is called end value. In other words, this is the amount of money that the workers should actually earn based on the amount of work that they did, in line with our planned value. Now, actual cost is the amount of money that was spent. So in this case, this is pretty straightforward. So actual cost for this project is 700. Now, our budget at completion is now how much we're budgeted for the whole project. And that's what we refer to as the budget at completion. So in this case, remember, each side 1,000, 4 sides. Therefore means that our budget at completion is 4,000. Then our cost variance. Cost variance now talks about the difference between our end value and then our actual cost. So let me ask you this question. Notice that at the end of the first week, they did 50% and they spent 700. So if I ask you how much should have been spent for the amount of work that was done, of course 500, which is what we have here. But then remember we said they spent 700. So if I now ask you by how much are we already over budget at the end of week 1? Good. You'll notice that by the end of week 1, we're already over budget to the tune of $200. So what we have just done is what we refer to as our cost variance. So the formula for cost variance is end value minus actual cost. So in this case, that will be 500 minus 700, which of course will give us negative 200. So that means that judging from what we have done so far, on week 1, we are already over budget by 200. Then we go to our scheduled variance. Scheduled variance, the formula is end value minus planned value. So in this case, it's going to be 500 minus, our planned value is 1,000. 500 minus $1,000, which will give us negative 500. It therefore means that for this project, we're behind schedule and we have work worth about 500 that was not done on week 1. Remember, they did half, and half ought to be 500. And therefore, we have another work worth about 500 that was not done on week 1. So that's why our schedule variance is showing negative 500. Then we talk about the cost performance index. So the formula for the cost performance index is our end value divided by our actual cost. So in this case, it's going to be 500 divided by 700. If we do 500 divided by 700, we're going to be getting, that's 5 over 7, and 5 over 7 will give us 0.714. It simply means that for every $1 we spent on this project, the value we are getting is about 71 cents. So that means we're not getting full value for money with regards to this project. That's exactly what this is showing. And then we calculate our schedule performance index. And then the formula for our schedule performance index is end value divided by planned value. End value divided by planned value. That's the formula for the schedule performance index. So in this case, it's going to be 500, which is the end value, divided by 1000, which is the planned value, and that will give us 0.5. So what that simply means is our progress rate is we're moving at 50% of the originally planned progress rate. And that's the interpretation of this figure that we have just gotten. So remember, we have our data here, which is our planned value up until budget at completion. We have interpreted the data using the cost variance, schedule variance, the cost performance index, and schedule performance index. So based on this interpretation, we now forecast. The forecast is now what we do with the estimate at completion. So estimate at completion is simply saying if work continues this way, by the time we are done, how much should we have spent? How much would we have spent in the course of carrying out the project? That's exactly what the estimate at completion measures. So the formula for the estimate at completion is your budget at completion divided by your cost performance index. So which in this case is going to be, our budget at completion is 4,000, and then our cost performance index is 0.714. So if we do the calculation, 4,000 divided by 0.714, that will give us 5,602.24. What does this figure mean? It therefore means that if work continues at this pace, by the time we are done, it's not going to be a $4,000 project any longer, but then we're going to be spending about $5,600. We're going to be spending little over $5,600 in all with regards to this project. And that's exactly what this figure here illustrates. So based on this, we now calculate what we call the estimate to complete. So estimate to complete now talks about, okay, so how much do we now need to finish the remaining portion of work? That's exactly what the estimate to complete measures, how much we need to complete the remaining portion of work. So in this case, the formula for our estimate to complete is our estimate at completion minus actual cost. So in this case, remember our estimate at completion is 5,602.24, and then our actual cost is 700. So if we do the math, 5,602.24 minus 700, that will give us 4,902.24. This is basically the amount of money required to finish the remaining 3.5 side of our fence. That's exactly what the estimate to complete measures. And then there is now the variance at completion. So variance at completion now says, okay, by the time we are done, by how much are we going to be over budget based on the new estimate that we have made? So the formula for this is your budget at completion minus your estimate at completion. So in this case, it's going to be the 4,000 minus 5,602.24. 5,602.24. If we do the math, it's now going to give us 1,602.24, which is negative. It therefore means that if work continues at this pace, by the time we are done, we are going to be over budget by about $1,602.24. And that's exactly what this calculation has shown us. So, notice that all of these things we have mentioned help us to understand at every point in time the status of our project, helps us to determine whether we are over budget, we are behind schedule, or we are ahead of schedule. That's exactly what this helps us to do. So one key takeaway from our discussion here is the fact that if you do your cost variance or your schedule variance and you get a negative answer, simply know that negative is bad, but then positive is good. So when you do your variance and you get a negative figure, just tell yourself this is a bad situation. So if it is with regards to cost and you're having a negative cost variance, it simply means you are over budget. If with regards to schedule and you're having a negative schedule variance, it simply means you are behind schedule. However, if the results are positive, so it means you have a positive cost variance, it means you are under budget. Under budget simply means you've not spent up to the amount that was budgeted for that particular activity. And then if your schedule variance is positive, it's also a good omen. It simply means you are ahead of schedule. In the same vein, if we talk about our indices, for your indices, you can get a result that is less than 1 or greater than 1. So in this case, a result that is less than 1 is bad. And then a result that is greater than 1 is good. So if we have an index, let's say cost performance index of 0.714, it simply means this is a bad situation. It means we're not getting full value for money, that for every $1 spent, we're getting about 71 cents as our value. And then also, a schedule performance index of less than 1 is bad. It means that in this case, our progress rate is about 50%. And like I mentioned, if it is greater than 1, it therefore means it's good. So if, for example, in our project, we have a cost performance index, CPI, of let's say 1.2, it means that for every $1 spent, we're getting more value. We're getting about 20% additional value for every $1 that was spent in the project. So that's exactly what this means. So remember we said for your variance, values negative bad, positive good, and then if you have 0, it simply means you're on target. For your index, greater than 1 is good, less than 1 is bad, and if you have 1, it simply means you are on target. So, except you're preparing, say, for the PMP exam, there might not be any need for you to learn all of these formulas like I have just explained. You might as well just know them for the sake of knowing them, because these are the underlying formulas that have been imputed in Primavera P6 to help us calculate the status of our project at any point in time. So all we simply need to do is to display the relevant columns, and when we display the relevant columns, you'll begin to see these figures. And like I mentioned earlier on, your ability to interpret the figures is now the most important part of this conversation. Alright, so let's dive into our Primavera P6. Now, don't forget, some of the formulas that we have made mention of, that's exactly what we have in this very slide. As the cost variance, remember we said cost variance is end value minus actual cost. There's a schedule variance, which is end value minus planned value. And remember we said -4 is behind schedule while positive is ahead of schedule. Cost performance index is end value divided by actual cost. So we said the worth of work got out of every $1 spent. Schedule performance index is end value divided by planned value. So this measures percentage progress made against the planned rate. While the estimate at completion is your budget at completion divided by your cost performance index. And then your estimate to complete is your estimate at completion minus your actual cost. So this is the amount that the project would cost from the current date to the end of the project. That's why I said that estimate at completion is the amount of money we need to complete, or rather to carry out the forecast that we are making that will require to do this very project. Variance at completion is our budget at completion minus our estimate at completion. So this is the amount the project would exceed or fall short of the planned budget by the end of the project. And then there's now the TCPI, that's the to complete performance index. So what the TCPI now measures is, we now want to be able to determine, based on the results we've gotten, what will be the rate of performance from our workers in order for us to still align our project with the initial budget at completion or the new estimate at completion. So if we want to be able to determine the rate of work that is needed to align or bring back the project to the initial budget at completion, we use the formula BAC, that is budget at completion minus end value, divided by budget at completion minus actual cost. However, if we want to realign the project to be in line with the new estimate at completion, then we use the formula budget at completion minus end value divided by our estimate at completion minus actual cost. Alright, so let's dive into Primavera and see how this works. Alright, welcome. So you remember that in the last lesson, we learned basically about how to update our project. Well, we talked about reporting, or what we talked about statusing. In other words, we reported actuals, and then we also reported actual start date and finish date, as well as the actual cost of our project. So right now, we're going to be looking at the end value management. In other words, we now want to be able to display some of those items that I've listed earlier on to help us interpret and understand the status of this project. It is pretty straightforward. Many of the things you're going to be doing in this case is just to display the relevant columns. So in essence, after you've updated, then you now display the relevant end value management columns that will help you give interpretation to bulk of the things we have mentioned. So these are some of the columns we are going to be displaying. Let us display some of the columns that we took a look at in the last explanation that we did. So we're going to be displaying the cost variance. So let's type in cost variance. Of course, I'm assuming that by now you already know how to display columns, and that's exactly why I'm going straight into this. So let's add the cost variance. Let's bring it down to after our total float, and then also our schedule variance. So let it be after the cost variance. Then our cost performance index. So we add our cost performance index as well, and of course our schedule performance index, which is already displayed here. I do not want to add end value cost, then also planned value and all of that, because I feel it will unnecessarily clog my columns. Otherwise, if I display them, you're gonna see some of those figures that we had mentioned earlier on. So but I just want to look at the interpretations instead of just looking at the data. Okay, so another thing I want to display is the estimate at completion cost. So I add my estimate at completion cost as well as my estimate to complete. So I've added that. Then I also want to add the variance at completion, and then the to complete performance index, which is the last thing that we have actually mentioned. Okay, good. So once I've added all of these columns, I click on OK, and then I now want to take a look at my table to understand exactly what is going on. So first, note that before you can do this, it is necessary that you status your project as at the date that you are updating. So in this case, we're updating as at 20th of March. So we have actually status our project as at 20th of March. So let's take a look at what we have here in the table based on the columns that we have displayed. Let me reduce some of these columns so that this will be a bit more conspicuous. Let me just show only the table without showing the Gantt. So this is exactly where we are. So notice that for this particular project, based on the report that we have done so far, let's first of all interpret the status of the project, which is the one we're seeing at the very top. So from the analysis, from what we've been doing so far, notice that cost variance here is showing 0. It therefore simply means that with regards to cost, that this particular project is still on target. In other words, we do not have any cost variance at all. Then our schedule variance is negative 12,214. It simply means that we have work worth about 12,214 yet to be done. Our cost performance index is showing 1. Obviously, since our schedule variance, since our cost variance is 0, that means we're on target. It also means that our rate of performance with regards to cost is also on target. So we're getting full value for money. And that's exactly what our cost performance index is showing here. And then our schedule performance index is less than 1. That is 0.61. So what this simply means is that for this particular project, we are progressing at a 61% rate. So we're not progressing at a full rate of the originally planned progress. So that's exactly what the 0.61 here shows. If things continue this way, our estimate at completion would be 150,000. Now, this 150,000 is how much we're now forecasting that we will spend by the time we are done with this project. And then therefore means that we need about 130,500 to complete the remaining portion of work based on the reports that we have given so far. So again, if things continue this way, it means that we're not going to have any variance at completion. And then the rate of performance needed from our resources is 1. So they should continue at the, in terms of cost, they should continue at the current rate. That's exactly the interpretation of this. Now, let's take a look at, this is for the project in total. If we now want to interpret with regard to specific activities in the project, so let's say in this case, our design building layout. So if you take a look at the design building layout, we had a cost variance of 1,000, meaning we're over budget for design building layout by 1,000. And then schedule variance was 0. It means we're progressing at the planned rate. The cost performance index was 0.83. This is per activity. Don't forget that what we do is that with regard to the project will now collate all of this and then now do the interpretation for the totality of the project. So the combination of the reports that we have done for each of these activities is what we see in the project analysis. So if you're taking a look at each of these activity analysis, you may notice that there's a bit of each activity has its own unique interpretation. But something interesting here happens. Notice that the design building layout is over budget by 1,000. Then also the M&E design is also over budget by 3,000. So in total, over budget is 4,000 for the two activities. The plumbing design is under budget by 1,000, so it cancels this other 1,000 here for the design building layout. And then the design approval is under budget by 3,000, so it also cancels this other 3,000. So that's why you're seeing 0 as the cost variance, because we have about 4,000 over budget as well as 4,000 under budget. It therefore simply means that our cost variance in total for this project is simply 0. Now let's do a bit of tweaking here so that we can see what will happen if the cost variance for these activities are different. So let me select this design building layout. So let me see, instead of actual of 6,000, I report an actual of, let's say, 8,000, and then I hit enter. Okay, good. So watch what happens. So you notice that the cost variance for the project changes to negative 2,000 because in total we're now over budget with respect to this project by about $2,000 or naira as the case may be. And then now see our cost performance index is now showing 0.91. It means we're not getting full value for money. And then it's also telling us that the estimate at completion is now 152 as against the 150 that we saw the last time. And then this is now the estimate to complete. So we need about 130,500 to complete the project. And by the time we are done, we are going to be over budget by 2,000 in total. That's exactly what the variance at completion here focuses on. So all of these are ways you can actually interpret the result that you're getting in your Primavera. So you can either interpret them based on each activity, based on the values you're seeing here, or you can interpret the phase of your project based on the values you're seeing. You can also interpret the status of the project from the values that you're seeing at the top of the project. So that's essentially how to update and do your tracking with regards to the project. So in a nutshell, remember like we said, once you've been able to display these relevant columns, there are also other relevant columns you can display for your end value though. But then these are the major ones. So once you've been able to display these relevant columns, the negative cost variance simply means your project is over budget by that amount. Negative schedule variance simply means you have work worth this particular amount yet to be done. The cost performance index of less than 1 means the situation is bad. That means for every $1 you're not getting full value, you're getting about the value displayed. Then your shadow performance index shows you your progress rate, which is a percentage rate you're progressing. And then your estimate at completion shows you how much you're budgeted, how much you estimate, how much Primavera is estimating that if work continues at this rate, how much you're going to be spending by the time you're done with the project. Your estimate to complete tells you how much you will spend to complete the remaining portion of work. Then your variance at completion shows you how much would have been over budget by the time you're done with the whole project if things continue this way. So you know probably how much you should be budgeting for extra. While your to complete performance index basically shows you the rate of work that should be expected at any point in time depending on the status of the project. So Primavera gives us actually a very good interface to be able to do that. However, there are also other tools that help us to be able to do end value management. One very nice tool is the Deltec Cobra. That basically helps us to carry out a detailed form of analysis with regards to end value. But other than that, if you do not have Deltec Cobra, I also think that Primavera is a very good tool to do your end value management. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. I want to thank you for listening and see you in the next lesson.